There are 40 square miles of Detroit where the streetlights no longer work. At night, whole neighborhoods return to a darkness the city has not known since before Edison. The lights went out in 2014. The budget could not sustain them. Some residents bought their own lamps and mounted them on porches. Most learned to navigate by memory, by the moon, by the glow of whatever still burns. In satellite photographs taken after dark, Detroit appears as a constellation, with vast spaces between the points of light. The gaps are not empty land. They are neighborhoods, blocks of houses, streets where people still live, still lock their doors at night, still wake to morning in a city that can no longer see them. This is what remains of the city that once made half the cars in America. If stories like this stay with you, cities that built nations and then watched themselves come apart, consider subscribing. We're working toward our first 1,000, and your presence here means these histories don't vanish with the places themselves. Detroit declared bankruptcy on July 18, 2013. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. $18 billion in debt, pensions gutted, services collapsed. But bankruptcy is a legal term. It does not capture what happens when a city of nearly 2 million people becomes a city of fewer than 700,000. It does not account for the 80,000 abandoned buildings, the quarter of the city that has returned to prairie grass and wild pheasant. The schools that closed with children's drawings still taped to the walls stand at the corner of Michigan Avenue and Grand River on a Tuesday afternoon. Count the storefronts, then count the ones that are occupied. The ratio will tell you something numbers cannot. A city does not die all at once. It dies in increments. A factory closes. A department store boards its windows. A family leaves in the night, owing rent they cannot pay. The departures accumulate. The absences compound. What was once a neighborhood becomes a suggestion of one. What was once a city becomes a monument to its own past. The people who remain, and there are hundreds of thousands who remain, live in a landscape that was designed for a population 3 times their number. Fire stations shuttered, libraries closed, buses that no longer run, emergency response times that stretch to an hour in some neighborhoods. They have learned to rely on each other in ways the city once provided. Block clubs that watch for fires because the nearest engine company is miles away. Neighbors who share generators when the power fails. Urban farmers who have turned vacant lots into gardens, not as a hobby, but as survival. Not as urban renewal, but as the practical matter of feeding themselves when the nearest grocery store closed and nothing replaced it. There is a woman named Marsha who has lived on the same block on Detroit's east side for 53 years. She raised 4 children in that house, bought it in 1971 with money her husband made at the Chrysler Jefferson plant. The neighbors on both sides are gone now. Their houses are empty shells. She mows their lawns in summer because someone has to. She calls the city to board up the windows when they break. Sometimes they come. Sometimes they don't. She has been offered money to leave. She stays anyway, not out of stubbornness, out of the belief, unshakable despite all evidence, that this is still her home. There are men and women in Detroit who remember when you could walk from the Ford Highland Park plant to the Packard factory and never leave the sound of the assembly line. When the auto industry ran 3 shifts and the bars stayed open all night to serve them. When the money was so good that workers bought houses in cash, raised families on a single income, sent children to college on assembly line wages. When Detroit meant something specific in the world, progress, production, the American century being built in real time. The factories are still there, most of them. They just don't make anything anymore. The Packard plant, once the most modern factory in the world, sits on 35 acres of Detroit's east side. Its windows are gone. Its roof has collapsed in sections. Trees grow from the upper floors. In 1903, it employed 40,000 workers, building luxury automobiles. It closed in 1958. For 66 years, it has been decaying in public, a slow-motion ruin visible from the freeway. Proposals to demolish it, proposals to save it. None of them happen. The building remains, neither dead nor alive, too expensive to demolish, too damaged to save, a monument to the industry that built Detroit and then left it behind. To understand what happened here, one must first understand what Detroit was. Not the ruin, not the crisis, not the bankruptcy. The city before the fall, the city at the height of its power, the city that believed, because it had every reason to believe, that the assembly line would run forever. In 1950, Detroit was the fifth largest city in America, the wealthiest per capita, the engine of the industrial world. What happens when that engine stops? To understand what happened here, one must first understand what Detroit was. Not the ruin, not the crisis, not the bankruptcy, the city before the fall, the city at the height of its power, the city that believed, because it had every reason to believe, that the assembly line would run forever. Detroit did not become the Motor City by accident. It became the Motor City because Henry Ford built the Highland Park plant in 1910 and installed the first moving assembly line in 1913. What had taken 12 hours to build, a Model T automobile, now took 93 minutes. The efficiency was revolutionary. The profits were staggering. And Ford did something no industrialist had done before. He paid his workers $5 a day, double the going rate, enough to buy the cars they were building. Workers came from everywhere, from the coal mines of Appalachia, from the cotton fields of the South, from Poland, Italy, Greece, Lebanon, Mexico. They came because Detroit offered what nowhere else could, a wage that could support a family, a job that did not require a college degree or family connections, just a strong back and a willingness to work. The promise was simple, and it was real. Work hard, buy a house, raise your children better than you were raised. This was not a dream. This was the assembly line. This was Detroit. By 1920, the city's population had reached 900,000. By 1930, 1.5 million. The auto plants ran 3 shifts. Ford's River Rouge complex employed 100,000 workers at its peak. General Motors became the largest corporation in the world. Chrysler built the tallest building in the city, 77 stories of Art Deco chrome and ambition. The Big Three did not just employ Detroit, they were Detroit. The money flowed from the factories into every corner of the city. The bars, the restaurants, the department stores on Woodward Avenue, the movie palaces, the neighborhoods that spread out in all directions. Block after block of modest houses where assembly line workers lived like middle class. Paradise Valley was the heart of Black Detroit. Hastings Street ran through its center. The clubs stayed open until dawn. Count Basie played the Flame Show Bar. Billie Holiday at the Paradise Theater. Aretha Franklin grew up on Belmont Street, daughter of a preacher at New Bethel Baptist. The neighborhood was vibrant, crowded, alive. It was also segregated. Black workers could get jobs on the line. Henry Ford hired black workers when other companies would not, but they could not live where white workers lived. The neighborhoods were drawn in invisible ink that everyone could read. 8 Mile Road was the line. North of it, white. South of it, the city proper. Increasingly black as white families began their slow migration to the suburbs. But in the 1950s, Detroit was still a city that worked. The factories were hiring. The wages were good. A man could graduate high school on Friday and start at Ford on Monday. 40 years later, he would retire with a pension. This was not exceptional. This was normal. The union contract guaranteed it. The United Auto Workers negotiated wages, benefits, health care, job security. The assembly line was hard work, repetitive, loud, dangerous, but it paid enough to make the hardship worth it. On a Friday night in 1955, Woodward Avenue was lit like daylight. The department stores, Hudson's, Kearns, Crowley's, stayed open late. Families drove in from the suburbs to shop. Teenagers cruised from downtown to the State Fair. The Fox Theatre showed first-run movies to sold-out crowds. The restaurants were full. This was a city of nearly 2 million people at the peak of its economic power. The richest city per capita in America. The arsenal of democracy that had built the tanks and planes that won the war. The city that put the world on wheels. The factory whistle blew at 6 a.m. By 6:15, the line was moving. Men in work clothes and safety glasses took their positions. The same position every day. Installing windshields, bolting on doors, welding the frame. 8 hours of repetition. The noise was constant. Metal on metal, pneumatic tools, the conveyor belt that never stopped. At 2:30 p.m., the whistle blew again. The day shift went home. The afternoon shift took over. At 10:30 p.m., the night shift arrived. The line never stopped. The cars kept coming. 60 cars an hour. 480 cars per shift. Nearly 1,500 cars a day from a single plant. Multiply that across the city. Multiply that across the decades. That is what built Detroit. Detroit made things. That was its identity. That was its pride. Other cities had finance, or politics, or culture. Detroit had production. The smell of the Rouge plant, oil, smoke, molten metal, was the smell of money being made. The sound of the stamping presses was the sound of the future arriving on schedule. There was no reason to believe it would end. The demand for cars was infinite. America was growing. The suburbs were expanding. Every family needed a car. Every year the models changed. Every year the factories retooled, and the workers returned, and the line kept moving. But the city was built on a single industry, and that industry was beginning to change in ways Detroit did not yet understand. What happens when the industry that built a city decides it no longer needs that city? Detroit made things. That was its identity. That was its pride. Other cities had finance, or politics, or culture. Detroit had production. The smell of the Rouge plant, oil, smoke, molten metal, was the smell of money being made. The sound of the stamping presses was the sound of the future arriving on schedule. There was no reason to believe it would end. The demand for cars was infinite. America was growing. The suburbs were expanding. Every family needed a car. Every year the models changed. Every year the factories retooled, and the workers returned, and the line kept moving. The neighborhoods reflected the prosperity. Brick bungalows lined the streets of the east side. 2-story colonials in the northwest. Corktown, Mexican Town, Hamtramck. Each enclave had its own churches, bakeries, social clubs. The Polish families in Hamtramck could walk to St. Florian's for Mass. The Lebanese in the South End gathered at the Maronite Church on Congress Street. The Italians in the East Side had their own grocers, their own feast days. These were not suburbs. These were dense urban neighborhoods where people knew their neighbors, where children played in the street, where the corner bar was a second living room for men coming off the line. Saturday meant Tiger Stadium. Sunday meant church and family dinner. The parks were maintained. The libraries were open. The streetcars ran on time until they were replaced by buses in the 1950s. The schools were overcrowded but functional. A high school diploma from Cass Tech or Central meant something. It could get you into college, or it could get you into the factory, which paid better than most college jobs anyway. Coleman Young was elected mayor in 1973, the first black mayor of Detroit. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, the power structure was still white. The factory floors were integrated. The neighborhoods were not. Federal housing policy enforced this. The Homeowners Loan Corporation drew maps of American cities and color-coded them by race. Red zones, predominantly black neighborhoods, were deemed too risky for loans. Banks would not lend there. Insurance companies would not insure there. This was not informal prejudice. This was government policy. Redlining. The maps have survived. You can see them online. The red zones in Detroit correspond almost exactly to the areas that would later be abandoned. But if you were white and working in the auto plants in 1960, you could get a mortgage. The GI Bill made it easier. The Federal Highway Act made it possible to live farther from the factory and still commute. The suburbs opened up: Warren, Sterling Heights, Livonia, Dearborn. New houses, good schools, yards for the children. The taxes were lower. The neighborhoods were newer. The city was fine for work. But you did not have to live there anymore. White flight began as a trickle in the late 1950s. It became a flood in the 1960s. Between 1950 and 1970, Detroit lost nearly 500,000 white residents. The black population grew, migrants from the South seeking factory work that paid better than sharecropping. But the city's tax base was shrinking. The people leaving had money. The people staying did not have as much. And the people arriving found a city that was already beginning to fray. The factories were still hiring. That was the crucial thing. As long as the Big Three were hiring, Detroit had a reason to exist. In 1965, you could still walk into a GM plant with a high school diploma and walk out with a job that paid $30,000 a year in today's money. You could still buy a house. You could still raise a family. The union protected you. The contract guaranteed your pension. You had health insurance. You had paid vacation. You had job security. Except the job security was not as secure as it seemed. The industry was built on assumptions that were already becoming obsolete. American cars were big, inefficient, built for a country with cheap gasoline and open highways. Foreign competition was minimal. Europe and Japan were still recovering from the war. But by the late 1960s, that was changing. Japanese cars were smaller, more fuel efficient, better made. Volkswagen had already proven there was an American market for foreign cars. Toyota and Nissan were coming, and the Big Three were not adapting fast enough. The 1967 riots changed Detroit permanently. The immediate cause was a police raid on an unlicensed bar on 12th Street. The deeper causes were decades of housing discrimination, police brutality, economic inequality, and the rage of a population that had been promised equality and given segregation instead. The riots lasted 5 days. 43 people died. 1,700 buildings were burned. The National Guard patrolled the streets with tanks. President Johnson sent in federal troops. When it ended, whole blocks of the city were in ruins. The riot did not cause white flight. White flight was already happening, but it accelerated it. Insurance companies pulled out of Detroit. Businesses did not rebuild. The photographs from 1967 show smoke rising from 12th Street, buildings gutted, soldiers in the streets. Some of those buildings were never repaired. They are still there, 57 years later, vacant. What happens when the industry that built a city decides it no longer needs that city? The question was not theoretical anymore. The Big Three were still in Detroit, but they were building new plants in the suburbs, in the South, in Mexico. The factories inside the city limits were aging. The equipment was outdated. The workers were expensive. Union wages, union benefits, union protections. From a corporate perspective, it made sense to build elsewhere. From the perspective of Detroit, it was the beginning of the end. The oil embargo hit in 1973. Gas prices quadrupled overnight. Lines formed at gas stations. Rationing began. Americans who had bought big Detroit cars, V8 engines, chrome bumpers, vehicles that got 10 miles to the gallon, suddenly wanted something different. They wanted fuel efficiency. They wanted reliability. The Japanese automakers were ready: Honda, Toyota, Datsun. Small, efficient, well-built cars that did not break down. Detroit was not ready. The Big Three had spent decades building cars for a specific American market: cheap gas, wide highways, planned obsolescence. The business model was simple: build a car that would need replacing in 5 years. Make it big, make it powerful, make it cheap. Profit came from volume. But the Japanese built cars that lasted, cars that did not rust, cars that started in winter. By the late 1970s, American consumers were buying foreign, and once they switched, many never came back. The factories began to close, not all at once, one plant here, another there. The layoffs were called temporary. Workers were told to wait. The line would start again when demand returned. Some waited, some found other work, some left Detroit entirely. The Dodge main plant in Hamtramck closed in 1980. It had employed 40,000 workers at its peak. The demolition began in 1981. The entire complex was gone within months. On the site, Chrysler built a new plant, the Jefferson North Assembly. But the new plant was automated. It employed 4,000 workers, not 40,000. That was the pattern. When factories closed, they did not reopen. When they did reopen, they employed a fraction of the previous workforce. Robots replaced workers. Automation replaced the assembly line jobs that had built Detroit's middle class. The union could not stop it. The contract could not prevent it. The economics were simple. Machines did not demand pensions, did not strike, did not get sick, did not need health insurance. The population declined steadily. 1970, 5 million. 1980, 2 million. 1990, 1 million. Every census brought worse news. The people who left were not random. They were the people with options: the educated, the employed, the young. The people who stayed were disproportionately old, poor, black, and out of work. The tax base collapsed. The city could not maintain services designed for 2 million people with revenue from 1 million. Detroit had always been a majority white city. In 1950, it was 84% white. By 1980, it was 63% black. By 2010, it was 83% black. White flight was not just suburbanization, it was abandonment. The suburbs, Warren, Livonia, Dearborn, were prosperous. They had good schools, low crime, functioning services. Detroit had the opposite. The schools deteriorated, crime rose. The police force shrank. Response times lengthened. Neighborhoods that had been solidly middle class in the 1960s were war zones by the 1980s. Coleman Young served as mayor from 1974 to 1994, 20 years. He inherited a city already in crisis and watched it decline further. He fought with the suburbs, who he accused of stealing Detroit's tax base while refusing to help with its problems. He fought with the state, which he said underfunded the city deliberately. He fought with the federal government, which cut urban aid throughout the Reagan years. He was not wrong about any of it, but the city kept declining anyway. The crack epidemic arrived in the mid-1980s. Whole neighborhoods were consumed. The murder rate spiked. In 1987, Detroit recorded 686 homicides, the highest in the city's history. The police were overwhelmed. Entire blocks were controlled by drug dealers. The firefighters were overwhelmed. Arson became epidemic. On Devil's Night, the night before Halloween, hundreds of fires were set deliberately. The fire department could not respond to them all. The fires burned themselves out. The buildings that survived were looted for copper, for fixtures, for anything that could be sold. The Hudson's department store closed in 1983. It had been the anchor of downtown shopping since 1891. 12 floors, more than 2 million square feet. When it closed, there were no buyers. It sat vacant for 15 years. In 1998, it was demolished in a controlled implosion. Spectators gathered to watch. Some cheered, Some cried. It was the largest building demolition in history at the time. The site remained a parking lot for years. There was a man named Thomas who worked at the Ford Wayne assembly plant for 32 years. He started in 1965, the year after he graduated from high school. He installed door panels, the same motion, 8 hours a day, for 3 decades. The plant closed in 2007. He was 59 years old, too young to retire, too old to find another job that paid what Ford had paid. He collected unemployment for 99 weeks. When that ran out, he worked security at a mall for $12 an hour. No benefits, no pension. The pension he had earned at Ford was still there. He would get it at 65. But he had 6 years to survive until then. He sold his house in Detroit, moved in with his daughter in Warren. He had believed the promise, work hard. The company will take care of you. The promise was not kept. Multiply Thomas by tens of thousands. That is what deindustrialization meant. Not statistics. People. Lives interrupted. Futures cancelled. Communities dissolved. By the 1990s, Detroit was a city in collapse. The factories that remained were barely hanging on. The neighborhoods were emptying. The services were failing. And the world had moved on. Silicon Valley was booming. The internet was exploding. The future was being built in California, not Michigan. Detroit had been the future once. Now it was the past. A symbol of what America used to make, used to be, used to promise. The 2000s began with hope. The casinos opened, MGM Grand, Motor City, Greektown. They brought revenue, jobs, a reason for people to visit downtown. The Super Bowl came to Detroit in 2006. The city cleaned up Ford Field, renovated parts of downtown, tried to show the world it was still viable. But beneath the surface, the decay continued. The population kept falling. The schools kept closing. The tax base kept shrinking. The General Motors Renaissance Center towers over the Detroit River, 7 glass and steel cylinders, the tallest building in Michigan. GM bought it in 1996 and moved its headquarters there. It was supposed to signal commitment to the city. But by the 2000s, GM was dying. So was Ford. So was Chrysler. The big three had not adapted to fuel efficiency standards, had not adapted to changing consumer preferences, had not adapted to global competition. They built SUVs because SUVs were profitable. They ignored hybrid technology. They assumed cheap gas would last forever. It did not. The 2008 financial crisis destroyed what remained. Credit froze. Car sales collapsed. In 2007, Americans bought 16 million new vehicles. In 2009, they bought 10 million. The big three could not survive that drop. GM and Chrysler declared bankruptcy. Ford teetered on the edge. The federal government intervened. The auto bailout. Billions of dollars to keep the companies alive. It worked. GM and Chrysler survived. But they emerged smaller, leaner, with far fewer workers. The plants that reopened were automated. The jobs did not come back. Detroit's mayor in 2008 was Kwame Kilpatrick. He was indicted on corruption charges that year: perjury, obstruction of justice, misuse of public funds. He resigned in September, went to prison. The scandal consumed the city at the exact moment it could least afford distraction. The emergency manager law was passed by the Michigan legislature in 2011. It allowed the governor to appoint an unelected official to take control of financially distressed cities. Detroit was the target. The emergency manager arrived in 2013. His name was Kevin Orr. He was a bankruptcy lawyer from Washington. He had 60 days to assess Detroit's finances. He took one look and knew. The city was $18 billion in debt. It could not pay its bills. It could not provide basic services. It could not maintain the streetlights. It could not respond to fires. It could not pay the pensions it had promised to city workers who had spent their careers serving Detroit. On July 18, 2013, Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The headlines went global. Detroit, once the richest city in America, was broke. The bankruptcy was not a surprise. It had been coming for decades, but it was still a shock, a confirmation that the city had failed, that the promises made to workers, to residents, to retirees could not be kept. The pensioners were hit hardest. Men and women who had worked as police officers, firefighters, sanitation workers, clerks, they saw their pensions cut by 5%. It could have been worse. It nearly was. There were proposals to cut pensions by 30, 40, 50%. The Detroit Institute of Arts nearly sold its collection to pay creditors. The idea was floated: sell the Van Goghs, the Rembrandts, the Diego Rivera murals, liquidate the art to pay the debt. A coalition fought back. Philanthropists, foundations, the state of Michigan. They raised $816 million, the grand bargain, to protect both the pensions and the art. It worked. The collection was saved. The pensions were cut, but not destroyed. But the fact that it came to that, the fact that selling the art was seriously considered, tells you everything about how dire it was. The bankruptcy reorganized Detroit's debt, wiped out billions, gave the city a fresh start, but it did not fix the underlying problem. The population was still declining. In 2010, the census counted 777 residents, down from 270 in 2000, down from 18 million in 1950. Whole neighborhoods were empty. The city owned thousands of abandoned buildings. It did not have the money to demolish them. It did not have the money to maintain them. They just sat there, decaying, dangerous, magnets for crime, arson, drug use. There was a woman named Gloria who lived on the east side. She had been a teacher at Kettering High School for 28 years, retired in 2008 with a pension of $200 a month. After the bankruptcy, it was cut to $2,005. She was 71 years old. She had believed the city would honor its commitment. She had paid into the pension every month for 3 decades. The bankruptcy judge said the city could not afford it. The math was simple. There was no money. The promises could not be kept. Gloria did not leave Detroit. She could not afford to. Her house was worth nothing. No one was buying in her neighborhood. She stayed in the house she had owned since 1979, watched the neighbors leave one by one, watched the streetlights go dark, watched the city she had served fail her in the most fundamental way. The bankruptcy ended in December 2014. Detroit emerged from it legally solvent. The debt was restructured. Services slowly began to improve. But the scars remained. The population did not rebound. The trust did not return. The people who had left were not coming back. What happens when the industry that built a city disappears? Detroit is the answer. The factories close. The people leave. The services collapse. The city files for bankruptcy. And the people who remain, the people who cannot leave, who will not leave, live in the ruins of what was once the richest city in America. Detroit did not die in 2013. It had been dying for 40 years. The bankruptcy was just the moment when the death became official, when the ledgers were opened and the truth was counted and the city admitted what everyone already knew. It could not sustain itself. It could not provide the services a city is supposed to provide. It could not keep the promises it had made. The physical decay tells the story better than any statistic. The Michigan Central Station stood abandoned from 1988 to 2018, 30 years of decay. Photographer Yves Marchand and Romain Meffre documented Detroit's ruins in the 2000s. Their images went viral. The empty ballrooms, the overgrown theaters, the schools with books still on desks, the churches with pews rotting under collapsed roofs. It was called ruin porn. Critics said it exploited Detroit's suffering for aesthetic pleasure. The photographers said they were documenting what was being lost. Both were right. The city began demolishing houses in earnest after the bankruptcy. Thousands of them. Entire blocks razed to vacant lots. The demolition crews worked systematically, street by street. The houses that came down were beyond saving. Roofs collapsed, walls unstable, contaminated by lead and asbestos. But they had been homes once. Families had lived there. Children had grown up there. And now they were being erased. By 2020, more than 19,000 structures had been demolished. The empty lots were seeded with grass. The city called it stabilization. Residents called it giving up. Some neighborhoods vanished almost entirely. Brightmoor on the northwest side, Poletown East, the area around the old Packard plant. Drive through them now and you see houses, then gaps, then more houses, then more gaps. The pattern is random. A block with 10 houses might have 3 occupied, 4 abandoned, 3 demolished. The people who remain live in a landscape of absence. Their neighbors are gone. The corner store is gone. The bus line is gone. They adapt. They fortify their homes. They form block clubs. They watch out for each other because no one else will. The water crisis hit in 2014. The city, desperate for revenue, began shutting off water to residents who were behind on their bills. Thousands of households lost running water. Families bathed their children with bottled water, used buckets to flush toilets. The United Nations called it a human rights violation. Detroit said it had no choice. If people did not pay their bills, the water department could not function. Both were right. That is the tragedy. The city needed the revenue. The residents could not afford the bills. There was no solution that did not hurt someone. The downtown began to revive. Dan Gilbert, the billionaire founder of Quicken Loans, bought more than 90 buildings in downtown Detroit, moved his company headquarters there, brought thousands of workers. Other companies followed. The stadiums were renovated. The restaurants reopened. By 2020, downtown Detroit looked better than it had in decades. Young professionals moved into renovated lofts. The bars were full on Friday nights. But this was a revival of 10 square blocks. The rest of the city, the neighborhoods where people actually lived, saw no benefit. The two Detroits coexisted: downtown prosperity, neighborhood abandonment. The money did not trickle out. The people who left Detroit scattered across the country. Some went to the suburbs, Warren, Sterling Heights, places that used to be separate, but now feel like extensions of the city they fled. Some went south, Atlanta, Charlotte, Houston, chasing jobs and warmer weather. Some went west. They carried Detroit with them, the accent, the memories, the pride in what the city had been, and the grief for what it became. There are reunions, former Detroiters gathering in other cities, other states. They talk about the old neighborhoods, Jeffries Projects, Hermann Gardens, the Brewster Douglas Towers, the housing projects where Diana Ross grew up, all demolished now. The reunions are part nostalgia, part mourning. They remember the Detroit that was, the Detroit that raised them, the Detroit that no longer exists. The legal battles continued long after the bankruptcy ended. Retirees sued the city, the state, the emergency manager. They argued their pensions were protected by the Michigan Constitution. The courts disagreed. The bankruptcy allowed the cuts. The pensioners lost. Some died before they could collect what they were owed. Others lived diminished lives, their retirement security destroyed by decisions made in courtrooms and boardrooms, by people who had never worked a day in a Detroit factory, or school, or firehouse. What was lost cannot be measured only in dollars or population. What was lost was continuity. Generations of families lived in Detroit. Grandparents, parents, children, all in the same neighborhoods, all working in the same industries. That continuity is gone. The children left. The grandchildren never came back. The family homes were sold or abandoned. The neighborhoods dissolved. What was once a community became a geography. Coordinates on a map where a community used to be. The city that remains is smaller, poorer, blacker, older. The population in 2020 was 639,111, down from 777 in 2010. The decline continues, but the people who remain are still there, still living, still raising children, still going to work, still maintaining their homes, still believing, against considerable evidence, that Detroit has a future. Whether that belief is justified depends on who you ask, and what you mean by Detroit. What happens when the industry that built a city disappears? Detroit is the answer. But the answer is not simple. It is not just decline. It is not just ruin. It is 639, 111 people still living in a city built for 2 million. It is neighborhoods that function through mutual aid because the city cannot. It is block clubs, urban farms, community gardens. It is the Heidelberg Project, an entire street turned into an outdoor art installation using the debris of abandonment. It is resistance, it is adaptation, it is survival. The factories still stand, most of them. The Packard plant was finally being demolished in 2024, piece by piece, slowly, at enormous cost. The Fisher Body Plant 21 is still there, windows broken, roof collapsed. The Dodge main site is now Jefferson North Assembly, building Jeeps with a fraction of the workforce. The buildings outlast the industry that built them. They outlast the workers who filled them. They are monuments now, to what was, to what ended, to what cannot be brought back. There are still workers who remember, men in their 70s and 80s who spent 30, 40 years on the line. They gather sometimes, union halls, retiree meetings. They talk about the plants, the shifts, the cars they built, the money they made, the promises they were given. They do not romanticize it. The work was hard. The conditions were harsh. The unions had to fight for every benefit. But it was work that paid enough to live. That is what is gone. Not just the jobs, the possibility of that kind of work. The social contract that said, work hard and you will be provided for. Detroit believed that contract. Detroit built its entire existence on it. The contract was broken. What was lost cannot be measured in population statistics or tax revenue. What was lost was the belief that industry and labor could build a common future, that a city could be sustained by making things, that the people who did the work would share in the prosperity. Detroit proved that belief wrong, or perhaps Detroit proved that the belief was abandoned before it could fail on its own. The city is changing again. The downtown is reviving. The suburbs are stable. The neighborhoods are still struggling. Some will recover. Some will not. Some are being reclaimed by nature. Prairie grass, pheasants, coyotes moving through streets where factories once stood. The city is smaller now. It will never be what it was. But it is still here, still Detroit, still home to more than 500,000 people who have chosen to stay, or had no choice but to stay, or were born into a city that shaped them, whether they wanted it to or not. Stand at the corner of Michigan and Grand River now. The streetlights are back on in some neighborhoods, not all. The abandoned buildings are being demolished. Slowly. The downtown has cafes and startups. The old Hudson site finally has a new building rising. But drive 10 minutes in any direction, and you will see the other Detroit. The empty houses, the vacant lots, the churches with no congregations, the people who remain. They are the answer to the question. What happens when the industry that built a city disappears? The people carry on. They adapt. They endure. They remember what was and live in what is. They do not have the luxury of nostalgia. They have only the present, and whatever future they can build from the ruins of the past. If this story moved you, if the rise and fall of the Motor City, the lives interrupted, the promises broken, the industry that built a nation and then left it behind? Consider subscribing. Let us know in the comments which abandoned place, which vanished city, which community erased by progress or disaster, or time we should investigate next. Thank you for bearing witness to what Detroit was, what it became, and what remains.